All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will get started soon. Welcome back to the Young Seers podcast. Please share this video, like, share, comment. It gives other people who may not normally have access to the live. It gives them access to the live as well. As you can see, I am live, so if you hear like background noises, something going on outside, my street is always lit here in New York. So I'm gonna try to ignore all that. That's what happens when you go live. So, again, hello and welcome back to the Young Seers podcast. My name is Jhani Travette, also known as the Young Seer, and your host for the Young Seers podcast, your source for rich, intellectual, and spiritual content where we discuss a variety of topics, engage the questions and popular movements of our time, and perhaps make a little art in the process. My season one this season is going to be I won't give too many details, but it's going to be quite a bit different from the next season, which I imagine may be a bit different from the season after that. Once I drop all of my philosophical gems, I'll call it that. We'll do some like artistic stuff. So thank you again for tuning in, and welcome if this is your first time. I'm going to say a lot of important stuff tonight. Part of my goal in doing this podcast is to generate conversation. So feel free to push back in the comments. Now, mind you, like you're not the only one who can push. So feel free to push back in the comments because, again, I like dialogue. I believe in healthy conflict, where we are listening to each other, exchanging ideas, and cooperating to establish meaning. So, again, please do engage. I don't yet have, at the date of this recording, I don't yet have a large audience, but I do have, I believe, an important audience or an audience full of important people, many of whom currently have larger audiences than me. Having attended Howard University and having traveled across the country as an itinerant speaker, I am no more than three at most degrees of separation from literally anyone in the United States. So I'm blessed with the privilege of having the ear and the attention of some very talented and influential people. Since the release of our first episode, other shows have joined the conversation, the quote unquote critical race conversation. If you remember, our episode number one was entitled God Bless America, a critical race conversation, as we called it. And some other shows have joined in the conversation and have produced some very valuable content. Jon Stewart, for example, just released an episode on his podcast. When I first saw it, it was entitled on YouTube, "Can a Racial Reckoning Fix America?" I think um, they've added a different title or made it a different title. After my first episode, I kind of understand if that is the case because you can't really boost a show or uh, a podcast with the name critical. The YouTube and Facebook, they're not going to let you like advertise that. So if they change the name of the show, I understand why. So yeah, other shows have also joined the conversation. You may be familiar with John Oliver's first episode back. He opened up his new season discussing the debate around critical race theory, which I thought was a pretty nice episode. And then there's NBC's who's airing a special entitled "Race and Rage: A Critical Conversation." Now, when I saw that title, I was like, okay, y'all getting a little close. In any case, So again, while I don't yet have a huge following, I do have an audience base that is important enough to provoke or stimulate conversation, and I'll take that. I'll take it. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. Whether you watch us live on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, or Instagram, or you prefer to download the podcast and listen while you're commuting, cleaning, cooking, or meditating, I don't take your support for granted. In the last episode, I discussed what I see coming in in this year 2022, in the realm of politics. I made politics the topic of the first episode because politics is the arena in which much spiritual or ideological warfare is currently playing out. After all, 2022 is an election year, and the more you can anticipate, the better prepared you will be to address what's coming. But allow me to reiterate, because I want to be clear that what's going on in the United States currently is deeper than politics. So I want to reiterate that the present day identity politics that you see at play live on the media and in real time is a byproduct of a deeper identity crisis that started in the early 2000s. I'll say that one more time. The identity politics that is being played out on media in real time in America is a byproduct of a deeper identity crisis that started um, early on in the 2000s. But yeah, again, we're talking about. In the last episode, I told you that a revival was coming to America, a deep intellectual awakening, and that the spirit of cynicism that was literally been overwhelming our politics since what 2016 was indicative of that. But in my book, I say this, and I give you the point of where it started, and I take you from there. This is chapter 4, I believe, in my book. I say this. Listen up. After George W. Bush's presidency, conservatism in the United States collapsed as a viable political doctrine. The country and the world at large witnessed what would happen if the philosophy that had defined the Republican Party for over 25 years took full effect. Having seen it in action since 2001, when Republicans gained control of both the White House and Congress, the nation rejected Reagan era conservative ideas entirely, whether consciously or subconsciously. It turns out that cutting taxes on the wealthy while reducing investments in programs that support working and poor citizens inflate the deficit and increase inequality, weakening the economy. For years, the wealthy gobbled up the economic gains of technological advancements, rising productivity, and growth of markets, while working and middle income Americans experienced stagnating incomes and rising poverty. Housing foreclosures and bankruptcy plagued working people as they lost their jobs, along with their healthcare coverage. Warnings from the Great Depression about ravages of an unchecked free market returned to the public discourse, not before markets collapsed and wiped out trillions in wealth. The Great Recession of 2007 to 2008 and the slow and painful recovery for years to follow, together with senseless wars abroad, would render the conservative movement morally and philosophically bankrupt. I don't stop there. But because I told you in last episode what happens when a belief system collapses. And what I'm showing you is when a particular belief system in America collapsed and caused a profound sense of identity crisis on the political right. I go on in the next paragraph to say the utter failure of conservative ideas would, in turn, bring about a profound state of identity crisis among the movement's most loyal supporters. The Republican Party's values began to shift. Its supporters were not so much conservative, constitutionally conservative, as they were fervently anti liberal or outright fascist. including white supremacist groups and evangelical nationalists, who came to make up a larger and larger share of the Republican base. These are groups of people who are captured by programming that is not very easy to shake, people who are susceptible to manipulative plutocrats and demagogues. Their heavily dogmatic views were reinforced by a rabid reactionary news media, creating an echo chamber of misinformation that is difficult to penetrate. No longer able to build a coalition using Reaganomics, ethnic anxiety and antagonism emerged as the dominant force binding the Republican Party together. And so this was right after, or really in the middle of, leading out of George W. Bush's presidency, and then going into Barack Obama's presidency. I want to pause right here for a second and say that while most Americans would agree that Barack Obama was an excellent president, his success in the primary or in the election that year, we all remember that year. But I want you to keep in mind that Barack Obama's use of the internet, while it gave him a major historic groundbreaking victory, it also taught our enemies how to manipulate and reach us, basically. So I want you to keep that in mind. I'll maybe, if I have time, I'll say that again, or I'll go into detail about that at the end. But you notice that after Barack Obama, that's really when a lot of trolling on the internet started to pick up. Um, a lot of misinformation. Uh, do you remember when the internet was just for nerds? And now, everybody's on there. So it's like it's the ghetto. And people are watching. When you make us, us a leap or a success, um, just keep in mind you got to keep on moving, um, because you got people who wants to appropriate what you're doing, who they want to take what you're doing and use it for their purposes. So while we all agreed that was a good thing that he won and he served as a statesman pretty well during his time, we also have to admit that we were not prepared for what our adversaries would do with the same opportunities. Because remember, before Barack Obama, it was unheard of that, people use the internet like he did to gain so much attention and so much support. So just keep that in mind. Just a little nugget. But moving on. Now, keep in mind that during that time when after George W. Bush's presidency, notice how, and I said this in my last episode, many Republicans are not actually for anything. They're actually against everything the Democrats say. And again, I'm not going to be talking about a whole lot about politics tonight, but what I'm going into tonight is very connected to our first episode, and so you're going to see how a lot of these things are connected. So anyway, they don't even a lot of Republicans don't even preach taxing the wealthy anymore because it doesn't sell. They will cut taxes on the wealthy, but they don't really preach it as a message. They don't really have a message, and we'll get into that. I want to circle back to that at the very end tonight. But around the time after George W. Bush's presidency, as Barack Obama was getting ready to take office, there were also a lot of millennials, especially not just millennials, but especially millennials, were growing disillusioned with religion, especially the kind of religion that teaches against science, what I call quote unquote closed book religions. We wanted to know, and by we I mean millennials. We you can't really just and a lot of us were born and raised in church, but you can't tell us to visit stories about a living God who does exploits and then don't show us that God. And I mean, in a biblical sense. We wanted to know a living God, not some version of one imprisoned within an ancient text. I admire the stories of David, of Elijah, of Samuel, and many other heroes of the Bible. But when was I supposed to get that experience? I wanted my own encounter with the living God, an encounter that is biblical in nature. And so this gap between what was being preached and what was being experienced, it led many millennials to divorcing themselves from religious communities en masse and created its own sense of identity crisis. And it is still going on today. And I mentioned this in my book that the era of mega churches kind of hid the fact that people were leaving evangelical Christianity in droves. It gave the impression of success when we were becoming more and more irrelevant to real life. So again, um, while the problem of identity crisis is indeed playing out in politics, it is, I believe, the symptom of a much larger disease, the solution to which won't necessarily be found in politics. This problem requires a bit of divine intervention, which is why I wrote my new book, Too Wise, Too Young, the first testimony of the young seer. My new book is designed to orient the reader to the new age. We're just living in different times. And if you want to be relevant, if you want to be able to thrive, you need to get this book. So serious. In fact, the ebook is out now on Amazon. I give chapter one for free on my website, but if you go to Amazon and actually click on the preview, you can see all the way up to chapter two. So plenty of the book is there if you want to get a snip of it before you actually purchase your copy. It's not a long book, but it's a very dense book. I'm a type of person that I like to use an economy of language. I've never been the type of person to use a lot of words to say a little bit of stuff. I like to use my words economically. I like to put a big pack into a small statement. So um, it's not a very long book, but it is a very deep book. I don't take you on a broad adventure, but I do take you deep. But again, yeah, my book is designed to orient the reader to the new age. We are just living in different times, and if you need a guide, that's going to be probably, I think, is one of the most important books since maybe Thus Spoke. We'll talk about that later. But of course, I'm only one person who doesn't have the same reach as an organized or established institution. If there were an institution where a solution should be found or whose jurisdiction this moment will fall under, it would be the church or religious institutions in general. But they too are on the verge of a major transformational shift. Even the most stubborn or resistant groups are going to be going through a major shift um, this year and in the coming years. This is why in this episode, I would like to discuss what I see coming for religious institutions. And I'm entitling tonight's episode Reviving the Lost Art of Prophesying. Reviving the Lost Art of Prophesying. I'm going to warn you, a lot of stuff you're going to hear tonight, for some of you anyway, it's going to be hard to hear, but it's going to be true nonetheless. Of course, you know me, I'm not the person that tries to tickle people's ears. I just say what it needs to be said, and I'll be on my way about my business. Reviving the lost art of prophesying. And I don't, of course, people may hear this and say, what do you mean? Prophecy has been happening uh, since the beginning of time. What do you mean reviving the lost art of prophesying? Yeah, and again, I told you I came up in church, so I have seen some things coming up in church. The church gets a lot of flack. Most of it is deserved. But if you came up like me in the black church, particularly the Pentecostal charismatic church, you would have at some point may have witnessed something that made you go, "Whoa, what was that?" And I'm not talking about something crazy. I'm talking about something like that was God. What in the world was that? One of the things that come to mind, and tell you this quick story. I'll tell you two stories. I was a kid, and there was this lady. Um, we knew her very well. Um, she was sitting in front of me in church. I was like on the side of the church, looking toward, not sitting in the front looking toward the back, but I was on one side of the church looking toward the other side of the church. And there was this lady sitting in front of me. If I say her name, there are actually some of her relatives who are actually friends with me on Facebook. Um, I knew her as Miss Harden. And so we were in church one night, and it's pretty packed service. There was this lady speaking. She was my one of my aunt's pastor at the time. She was up speaking, and if you came up in the Pentecostal charismatic church, you know what it's like to hear somebody um, prophesy, but prophesy almost like in a trance. The I am the Lord. They got the whole church goes silent, and someone lifts up their voice and begins to speak on God's behalf. Usually, these messages are really like simple. Uh, Obey. I'm coming. Something like that. These messages aren't always or aren't usually complex. Complex. But this particular night, despite the message being very simple, something happened. The pastor was up uh, speaking, and she started to prophesy. And at a certain moment, in the middle of her prophesying, I heard Miss Harden sitting right in front of me, and nobody else heard it. There was no way the pastor on the pulpit heard her say this. She was like in the zone, like entranced as well. She was quiet, listening like most people for the most of the sermon. And I heard her very low say on her breath. She said, "I am the Lord thy God." And when she said that, again, I was the only person who heard her. And when she said that, the pastor on the pulpit stopped and said, "Wait, somebody has it." And I'm looking like, and as soon as she says that somebody has it, Miss Harden starts to prophesy. And that blew my mind. So you came up in the black church, you've experienced some stuff. I got another one for you. When I start my experience with prophecy, um, I was speaking at a church in Evansville, Indiana, and I was uh, these were the days where I was a traveling itinerant speaker. I was super devout. I was so devout that they had to come get me from the backstage office because I was like backstage just praying the entire time. I was just praying. And I really, because I think part of the reason I was praying so much is that these were very skeptical people. So you had to come with the word. So I knew how skeptical they were, and I've never experienced, uh, and I'll go into in later episodes my experience with the gift of discernment and gift of prophecy. But I had never experienced such a hindrance to my gift. I would speak, and then I would go out and like talk to people individually, and prophesy to them. Um, but this particular time, I came out. I had been back there longer than I usually am back there or backstage. And when I came out, it was about time for me to actually speak. And so I didn't get anything. The spirit wasn't saying anything to me about anybody in the church. So what I did was I scanned the church to see if God had anything to say about anything in the audience, if I would pick something up. There was this one lady who, when I looked at her, I got this image, and I knew God was speaking to her. And so I told her, I actually remember part of what I said, and I usually don't remember. I remember because when I looked at her, I saw her standing in the middle of like this junkyard. It's just a bunch of craziness, and that's what I said to her. I said, when I look at you, it's like you're standing in the middle of a junkyard, and it's like a bunch of confusion going on around you. And I said a lot of other stuff. But after the service, one of my friends came up to me, completely shocked, and he said, "Do you?" Because I wasn't in there. I was backstage praying for testimony service. He said, "Do you realize that you repeated her entire testimony back to her?" And so everybody in the church is looking like. So I've experienced quite a bit of things coming up in church. So when I say reviving the lost art of prophesying, I'm not saying that stuff like that doesn't occur. What I am saying is we don't see it on the biblical level or on the big picture level in a way that actually shifts and changes events going on in the world. So don't get alarmed when I title tonight's episode "Reviving the Lost Art of Prophesying." That was a lot. So let me go ahead and get started. One of the most alarming things that was exposed by the pandemic is the dire status of our mental health as a nation. We are spiritually unwell. That someone who is clearly demented and incompetent, as our previous president, got anywhere near to running the Oval Office while brandishing fascism in plain sight demonstrates just how unwell we are. When millions of Americans are willing to entertain cynical illiberals like Tucker Carlson, we have a deep spiritual problem that needs to be sorted out before our culture further deteriorates. You may have noticed that Tucker, Trump, and their supporters have openly supported Vladimir Putin, who has recently invaded a neighboring nation, Ukraine, because their values as a nation have, over time, shifted from an authoritarian worldview to a liberal one. I have spoken out many times by the Spirit against the forces of authoritarianism and anti intellectualism in the past couple of years. But in my book, I actually give the playbook of authoritarians when I say to secure, and I want you to really listen to this, to secure economic dominance over foreign territories, political dominance is necessary. Still, revolt against foreign or outside rule from the natives of those territories is almost a certainty. Cultural dominance was the colonial answer to this problem. Christopher Columbus's letter on his first voyage to the Americas in 1492 portrayed Native Americans as primitive beasts who were docile and ripe for conversion. Soon afterward, the Roman Church divided control of the foreign territories among European nations in exchange for the effort to convert indigenous Americans and Africans to Christianity by any means necessary. Millions of Native Americans died as European colonizers brought them into contact with old world diseases. An estimated 12.5 million men, women, and children of African descent were forced into migrating halfway across the world via the transatlantic slave trade. So, this is important in understanding how authoritarians or nations with a medieval mindset rule or go about acquiring power. The playbook, again, is establish cultural dominance, to establish political dominance, and then you can have economic dominance in that order. In order to gain economic dominance over an area, you need political dominance. In order to gain political dominance without much pushback, you need to establish cultural dominance. And in the medieval age, this is where the church came in. The church was literally the arbiter of culture, everything culture. It was the church that gave European nations, starting with Portugal, the permission to subject West Africans to perpetual slavery. That stuff came into the world through the church. Because again, uh, the medieval mindset, which is around the time this new form of conflict against nations that were beyond the Mediterranean Sea, where European nations went and started fighting nations with whom they had no previous conflict. So that was a new type of thing. If you understand that economic dominance is established by first establishing political dominance, which is first established or reinforced by cultural dominance, you'll understand the playbook authoritarians um, gain their strategies from to assert their will over others. So, state religion ensures cultural dominance, which allows the state to assert political dominance and then economic dominance. That said, it should be easier for you now to understand why Russia has attacked Ukraine. What many people don't know is Kiev, which you've seen in the news a lot recently, is the capital of Ukraine. It is the Jerusalem or the Mecca, so to speak, for Russian state religion. And for the past century, give or take a few years, Russian Orthodoxy has become more and more liberal and less authoritarian. Its values have shifted, and it is speaking the language of human rights, religious freedom, and trusting in science. And that's a big deal. That's a big deal. When you establish as one of your values trusting science, then that fact alone requires you uh, to shift your theology in a major way, as science forces us to admit that many of the religious assumptions from the medieval age are utterly false. I'll say that one more time in hopes of not losing anyone. What you see happening in Ukraine is a result of authoritarians losing cultural dominance over a very important area to the state church of that particular region. And again, this is a big deal because trusting in science means a major shift in theology as science forces us to admit that many of the religious assumptions from the medieval age are utterly false. And here's where I reveal what's coming for religious institutions, large and small, major and minor, whether you're Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant. The same is true for Islam and Judaism, all of Abraham's children, all the Abrahamic religions. I foresee major schisms occurring in religious institutions. Many will call it demonic, they will call it ungodly, but it will be by the Spirit of God, as all power belongs to God, and ultimately nothing occurs outside the divine will. So, once again, I foresee major schisms or divisions coming to religious institutions, and I'll explain why. In the previous episode, I informed you that America is going through an identity crisis and is on the verge of a major intellectual awakening, similar to the movement that gave birth to the nation. Well, today, I tell you that many religious institutions will adopt liberal theology and do away with classical authoritarian theology, and that will cause some controversy and major divisions. I want to pause there before I go into detail because, again, a lot of things you're going to hear tonight are going to be hard to hear. So I need to establish some context. I am a Christian. I consider myself a Christian despite years of renouncing religion altogether. And when I say I'm a Christian, I mean that I am a lifelong student of the Christ and aspire to be a follower of his example. It means that I celebrate Christmas with my family. I keep Easter Sunday solemn because I believe these festivals and rituals enrich life. Could you imagine what winter would be like were it not for festival celebrations like Christmas? Just depressing, right? So I believe these rituals are important, and I do keep them. So I do identify as a Christian. I am not a biblicist. I am a logosist, and I'll explain what that means in a second. I am not a Christian fundamentalist. I am a liberal Christian, a Christian with liberal values. And here's why I am a liberal Christian. And I'm giving you all this context before I go into detail about what I see coming for religious institutions, because I'm not merely uh, someone who is I'm not trying to get anybody to denounce um, their religiosity or their spirituality, but I'm literally only saying what I'm seeing coming, what is inevitable as time progresses. So I'm not a biblicist. I am a logosist. I am not a Christian fundamentalist. I am a liberal Christian. And the reason I am a liberal Christian is because I believe that a belief system is only as good as its ability to explain things and predict things. This is called explanatory power and predictive power. If your belief system does not have explanatory power, for example, I went into details in my last episode of not just what I see coming, but I explain why it's coming. I give you the source, cause of the events that are going to transpire. That is called explanatory power. And the predictive power is probably the most important to me, especially as a seer. If you're the only reason I was allowed to foresee the pandemic and to foretell the events that happened during the pandemic, and be accurate and detailed, is because my belief system has predictive power. And these are explanatory power and predictive power. These are scientific terms, or terms that are more at use in science communities. Predictive power is the ability of a theory or a belief system to accurately make predictions. For example, the theory of evolution was able to make prediction that were some species that are missing in the chain link from one species to another species. And if evolution is correct, they will be able to identify or see where there's some missing links. And come to find out that's usually true. The periodic table, you may have heard of the periodic table. Even before we knew all the elements, the theory that allowed us to organize these elements suggested that there were elements that we didn't even know about that could go into different places on the periodic table. That's predictive power, where you have a theory or belief system that allows you to predict what is going to happen. Now, keep in mind that according to uh, Paul the Apostle, the kingdom of heaven is not a presentation of words, it is a demonstration of power. The reason I subscribe to liberal theology is because I have seen more miracles. I'm talking about mouth drop to the floor miracles, um, and have witnessed what I would describe uh, as a biblical display of God's power under this umbrella. Again, I believe what I believe because of explanatory power and predictive power. Keep in mind that God has not given us the spirit of fear, but one of love, power, and of a sound mind. So, that said, I want you to hear a snip from my book that's going to take me into why there's a major schism coming. Again, as I said at the very beginning of this, uh, you don't have to everything you're going to hear is not going to be comfortable to hear from many of you, because I know my friends on social media, especially if you have the same background as I have. But I want to, again, not just give you what's going to happen, but explain why it's going to happen. That's that explanatory power that I was talking about just a minute ago. Are you paying attention? Listen up. I say in chapter 6 of my book, a person's, and this is a big quote, so bear with me. A person's perspective is limited by their experience. The universe is an unlimited data source that we cannot compute or experience in its entirety, even if we lived billions upon billions of lifetimes in physical form. To make sense of life as best we can, our minds prioritize and organize data input from observation or study. From there, we create working theories, systems of ideas that best fit our experience and are useful for making decisions and predictions. We turn to community, science, literature, art, philosophy, religion, and other knowledge domains to help us do this. For lack of experience in our youth, we adopt and live by the framework of ideas that we inherit from our parents or caretakers, which we edit or abandon over time as our brains develop fully and we come into contact with reality for ourselves. Some ideas manage to be powerfully convincing and survive for many generations despite having little basis in fact. Limited powers of observation, for example, had the world convinced for many thousands of years that the Earth is the center of the universe. We currently take for granted that the Earth revolves around the sun, which revolves around the galaxy center. But humanity initially met this idea with hostility and skepticism. It was counterintuitive to mainstream thought in ancient times, ultimately gaining widespread acceptance many centuries later. This tendency to resist discoveries when they threaten the sense of security and comfort we find in our belief systems is a historical stumbling block for humans. Indeed, dismissing and antagonizing the truth is a severe threat to our collective well being. Yet, throughout history, it has wreaked havoc in every generation. It has brought down nations and destroyed empires. It shows up worldwide in all of our institutions and plagues humanity to this day. The heliocentric model of the solar system, or the idea that the Earth and all the other planets revolve around the sun and not the other way around, it did more than drastically transform how humanity views life and nature. Along with many other disruptive scientific discoveries, it changed how we establish truth entirely. Before the scientific revolution, reality was largely defined in superstitious terms by powerful men of a politically consolidated Christian church. Fundamental to their worldview was the idea that humanity and earth are central to divine creation, all existing for the distinct purpose of winning or losing salvation. They interpreted all of life's events as otherworldly, including chance events like thunderstorms or earthquakes. And the powerful clergymen were the sole authority on scriptural interpretation, which made them the gatekeepers of salvation and condemnation. They maintained a vast influence on society until the 14th and 15th centuries, when their private misconduct and corruption began to unfold publicly. Savage wars in the name of religion also became worrisome and repulsive to many. But what were proved the most devastating to the old way of thinking was the rise of science as a competing epistemic paradigm. Science, or natural philosophy, single handedly discredited many long standing assumptions, overthrew fundamental beliefs and attitudes, and caused much upheaval in its wake. Advancements in technology allow for great leaps in multiple disciplines, and here's where it really hits the roll. Discoveries in physics, math, biology, and chemistry would eventually reveal that Adam and Eve are mythical and not historical characters. That's going to be hard for a lot of people to hear. Descending from a renowned couple living several thousand years ago is not how human life came to be. We know this has overwhelming evidence to back it up. We know that humans have existed on Earth for far longer. Homo sapiens, which is our species, arrived in Africa around 300,000 or so years ago with a population of no fewer than 10,000 souls. We know that our bodies evolved over millions of years into their current divine state as biological machines capable of complex thought. And if you found that hard to hear and you're still listening, God bless you. But I got something for you in the next paragraph. It's going to give you insight into how I approach the scriptures. But stories need not be historical to be beneficial. Myths can convey powerful lessons and give insight into ancient thought. The biblical narrative of Adam and Eve is most revelatory when understood as an allegory about growing out of childhood. The story of Adam and Eve reads much better as a parable that encourages a young person of the ancient age to learn and accomplish as much as possible before exploring sex. It warns that anyone who will abandon their childhood innocence to experience the pleasure of heterosexual intercourse will also experience the subsequent unavoidable dread of adult responsibility. Parents must work hard to care for offspring successfully. Adam and Eve's story captures all the difficulties that being a caretaker implies. And of course, I'm not going to just say that without backing it up. When keeping in mind just how strong of a force the sex drive is, one can begin to see just how valuable such a parable would have been in ancient times when the average life expectancy was less than half it is now. It would have had great value as a bedtime story to be fully unwrapped when a child reached puberty and entered a new stage of life within civilized society. Symbolically, the Garden of Eden represents childhood. The tree of life represents intellectual or spiritual ambition. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, meanwhile, represents sexual ambition. The story posits sexual intercourse as the end of childhood, and it captures the usual tension generated during this time between parent and child. Written around 1000 BC, around the time of King Solomon, it turns the symbolism of Canaanite fertility cults of the day upside down in opposition to Mother Goddess worship. These groups employ prostitutes in sacred rituals to persuade the heavens to provide rain and abundant crops. It sets the Adam and Eve story sets Judaism on an unprecedented course to become a monotheistic religion. Knowing the difference between good and evil is an old euphemism for reaching puberty. In ancient times, societies in the Middle East granted a degree of agency to a person who reached sexual maturity. Still, speaking directly about sex was considered taboo, so they opted for quote unquote knowing right from wrong to do so indirectly. It shows up in three other books of the Bible: Deuteronomy 139, Isaiah 17:15 and 16, and Hebrews 5:14, as well as in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the oldest surviving great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the wild hunter Enkidu becomes civilized or like a god through sexual initiation. He cannot return to living in the wild after being seduced by a prostitute. Pagan fertility cults were also associated with serpents symbolically. Before receiving advice from a serpent and eating fruit from the tree of good and evil knowledge, Adam and Eve were said to be naked and unashamed. Another unsubtle reference to prepubescent childhood. Life after puberty demands more privacy. The Jewish bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah for girls, a coming of age ceremony, commemorates reaching this point of life and turns it into a celebration. A party ideally alleviates parental grief and tension with the child. Moreover, two places on the human body resemble trees: the head and the pubic area, reinforcing the parable's meaning. Dogmatic religious individuals still claim the Adam and Eve story should be interpreted literally as an actual historical event, but one who takes this position must address the mountain of well established empirical facts to the contrary. There are also quite a few conceptual problems to deal with as well. The tree of life, for example, is a hallmark of ancient folklore, but is made useless in a literal interpretation of the biblical creation story. Given that the death penalty did not exist before sin, and sin cannot exist before the divine command, its place in the garden serves no purpose in a literal interpretation. What benefit or use does a tree that grants eternal life have to people whose lives will never expire? A literal interpretation also then makes the existence of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil a cruel trap from a humanized God. God is also trapped, in a sense, into petty drama. One might say the story could make for good reality TV were it not for the talking serpent. To make sense to anyone living after the scientific revolution, remember I told you science proves that Adam and Eve did not exist historically. And I can say that boldly because I know you can scour the internet and you're going to find out the same thing. Not a single respectable biblical scholar believes that the creation story is actually history. So, to make sense to anyone living after the scientific revolution, Christianity must be interpreted in a similarly symbolic fashion as the creation story. In the Christian scriptures, the death and resurrection of Jesus are purported to remedy Adam's sin and the penalty of death it imposed upon all living things ever since. For as in Adam all died, so in Christ all will be made alive. The author of the Pauline epistles famously writes that Adam and Eve did not truly exist, however, makes the doctrine of original sin unfounded. And since original ancestral sin is a baseless idea, as is the notion of a vengeful God, salvation from physical death or eternal wrath is unnecessary and unwarranted. Contrary to ancient superstition, and I know what I'm saying right now is really heavy for a lot of people, but contrary to ancient superstition, we now know that physical death is not, in and of itself, a penalty for wrongdoing. It is a natural and necessary component of biological life that allows living things to renew and upgrade themselves in response to an ever changing and often hostile environment. Birth and death are simply evolutionary principles playing out as a characteristic property of the universe. Humankind is not in danger of a petty, wrathful God. Such ideas were formed many worlds ago in societies that understood and related to nature in ways that are drastically different from a sensible society living in current times. So, in my previous episode, I talked about the American revival that's coming as a byproduct of identity crisis, and I talk about how the revival that is getting ready to happen is similar to the one that started the American Revolution or led to the American Revolution or the Enlightenment. And I told you that the Enlightenment was started as a byproduct of the scientific revolution. Now, mind you, the Reformation, the forming of the Protestant movement, all of those are also byproducts of the scientific revolution. Like I just mentioned, there was a huge pushback from religious authority when people were really coming to discover that, wait a minute, the solar system doesn't revolve around the Earth, everything revolves around the sun. That was a big deal. It was enough to get you put in prison or killed. But today we just take it for granted. And so what I'm telling you now is that many churches are 500 years late and they're just about to receive what I call the software update. What happened to me when I talked about my awakening in 2017, it felt like a download, like this a bunch of information just downloaded to you at once. It was at that moment that it was revealed to me that I didn't have to throw away Christianity because there was a version that exists, that has always existed, and that the version that I subscribed to was a relic from the medieval age and not from first century Christianity. Keep in mind that when Christianity was first formed, there were many different versions of Christianity. The one that actually became the most famous is the one that had politics behind it, and the one where they would actually kill you if you did not join the group. That said, I would like to bring it back to why there is coming a major schism or division in religious institutions. Number one, uh, you can't hide these truths from people anymore. I heard a sermon maybe a year or so ago, and the preacher asked, "When did the saints start using the word energy?" And my response was like, what, fifth grade science? Like, we can't use energy now? A very scientific term with a definition, and we can't use it to describe spiritual things. So this movement against learning anything new. If and really my podcast is for people who have graduated from a strictly biblical worldview who yet know God. And God is real in your life, you're spiritual, but you're not bound uh, between the pages of Genesis and Revelation. You know God for yourself, not through Moses' testimony. You those testimonies are important. And I'm not trying to throw away the Bible. I'm not trying to tell you that you don't need the Bible. The Bible is very important to me. Reading it was very transformative. And for the most part, because it showed me that the whole system that we had set up that I attended every Sunday was just completely unbiblical. What I read about in the scriptures did not match what I was experiencing uh, every week in church. We had designed something completely distinct from what I read about in the scriptures. So I give later on in the book, I give the version of I tell you exactly what started Christianity and how the version that is going to be and this is not just Christianity, this is Islam and Judaism, the version of these religious systems that is going to survive and thrive in the future is different from a lot of what you see today. And if that's hard to believe, keep in mind, again, I came up as Pentecostal. Pentecostalism is a 20th century movement. It's a very young movement, and it's a movement that occurred as a byproduct of the holiness movement from the 19th century. So, uh, if you want to pretend like your version of Christianity been around for forever, continue to do that. But keep in mind that you're not going to be able to win any new souls. You're just going to be juggling people from one congregation to another next, and these are the people who were born and raised in church and can't really escape it. That's all you're doing. And then since you're drawing from a smaller and smaller pool of people, you're not winning souls. Basically, you're just shuffling them around. So that's the hard truth that a lot of people. And again, feel free to push back. Bring your arguments, bring the best ones you got, scour the internet, search again, if I say stuff like this, it's because I don't say stuff that I haven't thought about at length, especially things like this that can like really topple people's beliefs. But it's time. We're at a point in history where there's some things you cannot deny anymore. We're at a point in history where you're not going to be able to go past this point uh, with certain beliefs. And so what you see happening in Ukraine is literally a, a religious institution changing, sh- beginning to shift beliefs in it. And it hasn't even done it just recently, but over time, it has abandoned authoritarianism for a more liberal worldview. And then you got authoritarians in Russia who said, "Wait, if we lose cultural dominance, then we're going to lose political dominance. If we lose political dominance, we're going to lose economic dominance." Which is why also in the United States, you have people who are trying to their political strategy is to fight culturally. Again, because cultural dominance needs to precede political dominance, which precedes economic dominance. But here's the thing: authoritarian worldview will not lead to innovation. If your religious community is a closed-minded, closed book religious institution, you're not going to be you have a culture that is not committed to learning anything new. You have a culture that refuses and probably won't even understand anything that is contrary to what they read in the scriptures. And if you have that mindset where you can't even digest information that is contrary to what you've been taught or even what you see in the scriptures can say one thing and then science can say another thing and you immediately throw it out. What you're doing is creating a culture that is going to be deteriorating over time. So what you have now is people, and people really wonder why there is a lot of narcissism in church. That's because people serve a narcissistic God. If you believe that God is psychotic enough that he's going to put people in hell for eternity and torture them there, not annihilate them so that they just don't exist anymore, but literally keep them alive and keep them in torture for all of eternity, you serve a psychotic God. It's no wonder why narcissism and uh, psychotic behavior is happening uh, in your midst because that's the type of God you serve. And so in my book, I really make a case against biblicism and the harm that it has brought to my family. I go into detail, which is why I had to let my family read the book first. I go into details connecting uh, uh, harmful ideas, harmful teachings to the actual outcomes that they have produced in my family. Biblicism, Christian fundamentalism, whatever you want to call it, biblical literalism, it has not had the effect of making my family better people. And I love my family. And I'm telling you. And we can have some church. My family can get together without anybody outside my family. And when I tell you, we can go in, but there are many learning disabilities that go unaddressed. There's many emotional issues that goes on unaddressed, and people don't really think about how these ideas affect uh, the children that you are like teaching them to. Nobody sorted this out before us. It takes, which is why I very very often say I'm speaking a great deal to millennials. I'm speaking to everybody, but I believe millennials are the generation to be like, that don't I don't care who wrote it. That don't make any sense. You can't have a God who is all loving and a God who's going to torture people forever and ever, world without end, nonstop. You don't get a break. You don't get you like torture forever. That's unhealthy. And the reason I don't care about uh, being bold to say this stuff is because again, I got predictive power on my side. I got explanatory power on my side. I can like show you how these beliefs affected people that I love. And so what we have is an unhealthy relationship with religion, an unhealthy relationship with God, unhealthy relationship with the Bible. The Bible is a beautiful, beautiful book, but taught wrong. Did you even here's a big mistake because some people ain't gonna like what I'm saying tonight. Here's the biggest mistake that black churches make, or church, especially evangelical Christians make, is we confuse now, and I want you to actually search this tonight. I want you to research it. This is something the Bible doesn't even do. We confuse the word scripture with word of God. And in the scriptures, those two words are never used interchangeably. I'm going to say that one more time. The scriptures are not the end all, be all of a living God. the scriptures are not synonymous with the word of God. Everything that proceeds forth out of the mouth of God is authoritative. And what he said tonight is more authoritative than what he said yesterday. You mean God stopped talking at the last sentence, at the last period in the book of Revelations? I don't think so. And I wouldn't want to serve that type of God if that was the case. I don't believe you can call yourself a prophet. And some of these people they prophesy, they can't prophesy without opening up the scriptures. Like, do you not hear God or what? There's nothing and no one between God's mouth and the ear of his prophet. Like, so either you hear him or you don't. And what's the problem is you if you get rid of the scriptures for a lot of people, they feel like, well, I have no foundation, I have no framework, I have no structure, and it's just going to be a bunch of chaos. Actually, what I have learned is that there is much agreement between logosists or people who use reason as their as the sole rule of faith and spiritual practice. Where the confusion comes in is when you got all these biblical people. Because here's the thing, if you really know the scriptures, and I really know the scriptures, if you really know the scriptures, you would know that some of the scriptures were written purposely to contradict other scriptures. For example, you remember that parable in one of the synoptic gospels where Jesus is telling a story about Lazarus going to hell, and he says that uh even if you were to come back, they still wouldn't believe. If somebody from the dead would have came back and told them hell is real. Like, you don't want to come here. It says they still wouldn't believe. The book of John was written decades later, and he literally has a story of a man named Lazarus coming back from the dead, and that miracle convinced a great deal of people in that area in the story. That contradicts, and it's purposely written that way to contradict it. Another thing, did you know that Paul doesn't talk about hell at all? And letters of Paul was one of the first Christian documents. We had Pauline epistles before we had Mark. Mark was the first gospel that was written. Matthew and Luke kind of basically copies Mark. It's literally just copies of Mark with some stuff added to make the story more magical. But we had Pauline epistles before we had Mark. Do you know that hell as in the way that we know it today does not come from Paul? A lot of what we know about hell comes from movies, Dante's Inferno. So what happened after the Enlightenment or the scientific revolution, then the Enlightenment, was that culture started to shift. And so instead of the church being uh, the center or the hub of culture, church had lost its moral authority, and it has never gained it back. Not like it had it in the medieval age. So what happens in Western democracies is culture is largely defined by Hollywood or what celebrity you follow, what music or art you consume. Um, but I do believe that present day and as science has gotten better, technology has gotten better, I do believe that there is an opportunity for religious institutions. This is not me talking against religious institutions per se. I want to show you not just what is getting ready to happen, but a huge opportunity, because again, a lot of people are dismissing organized religion, but they are not dismissing God or spirituality. There are even atheists nowadays who acknowledge the importance of gathering together in beautifully built sanctuaries, of gathering together as a community, and they're some of the most spiritual people that you can find. I have found people who I knew, who I was like, you know God, who were not Christian. So I'll give you a lot of stories going forward, but I wanted to come on here and tell you that I see schism or divisions coming as more eyes are going to be open um, to just truths about science and things that we know because of evidence. There's plenty of evidence to back it up. Um, what I do in my book is I take natural philosophy, also known as science, and spiritual philosophy, and I marry them so that there needs to be no conflict between your spiritual beliefs and what you learn at school. That you don't have to get over the pulpit and chastise people for using a word like energy. That you don't have to walk on eggshells when we start talking about science and evolution. For me, a liberal Christian, there's no conflict. I can prophesy all day long and acknowledge that the Bible is should be read allegorically. As Paul said, if you've got a problem with what I said, I don't want to see your argument. I want to see your power. What power do you have? I've shown mine, and I'll continue to show it. Uh, and I don't say that braggadociously or with my chest thumping, but I say that in faith. This is what faith looks like. So yeah, if we don't establish a culture of learning and open mindedness, then we will be like Russia, who, and let me tell you what Tucker Carlson and Trump and Putin have in common. They looked at the data and they realized the future does not look bright for them and people who hold their beliefs. So they're getting desperate, these authoritarians. They're getting desperate. And the only unfortunate thing with Vladimir Putin is he has an army and he's a little more competent than Trump. The saving grace with Donald Trump is that he was incompetent. And of course, this is America, so you can't just make a decision and think you got to go. You got to go through some steps. We kind of put those checks and balances in place. So you can't just be causing wars on a whim because you looked at the future and realized things are not looking good for us. Our economy is going to slip. So they're not being innovative. And don't get me wrong, I don't have nothing against Russia. When I put out my mixtape in like what was it, 2014, I got a lot of love over in Russia. So I don't say this as a down for the Russian people, but I have to be objective about if you live in an authoritarian regime or authoritarian country that is not producing any innovation because they have a state religion and they don't value freedom of speech and freedom of thought and open-mindedness. You are going to you're going to create a culture in which there is no invention, there is no learning, there is no growth. And I want to say that to the black community as well, because uh, a lot of our issues can only be dealt with on a cultural level. If you create a culture where you are pushing kids to learn science and math and not, okay, well, don't accept that because, we believe this. And maybe that's not, and you're teaching them to diminish their light. You're not going to have a culture you're not going to draw any talented people. You're going to have a church full of idiots. You're going to have musicians who are copying what's going on in the world and not actually innovating in church. You're going to have your church is not a hub for creative artists. there's no place for people like me. So we have to go to have residencies and galleries. And that's actually where right before the pandemic, from late 2019 to when the pandemic like took off, I literally lived in an art gallery. But if you want to open up your church to a new generation, because there's a huge opportunity to reach people, especially people who've graduated from a strictly scriptural worldview. If you want to do that, my advice to these churches, I don't care how many screens you put up, it don't matter. It's your content. It's not the way your stage look. It's not how your carpet looks. It's not how many chairs you got. It's your content. You're not actually saying anything. So you can put up all the LED screens, you can put up all the lights, you can make it look like a concert, you can dim the lights in the church. Don't nobody care. Millennial children, people don't care about that. They care about what you have to say. And if you're not saying anything, you're not going to be join any of the type of souls that you're going to actually need to thrive in the future. All right, but I'm going to close out soon. I'm going to go once again. If you're on my mailing list, you already know that Too Wise, Too Young, the first testimony of the young seer, is now an ebook available on Amazon. The audiobook will be available soon as well. But right now, I'm going to stop there, get my life together, and go drink some water because thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back for some more controversy. No, I don't try to be controversial. Um, but that's all for that I have for you tonight. There's coming a major schism in religious institutions, large, small, it doesn't matter. And those whose faith are founded on reason, and in my case, I will call that the logos. I actually explain what the logos is in my book. So the logos for me is the sole rule of faith. The scriptures are very important, but they are not uh, the rule of faith for me or for liberal Christians. Um, but more and more people are going to be awakened to that. And part of my responsibility in this season is to facilitate the transition. Because again, some things are not going to be allowed to come into the new age um, with us. And there are some hard truths that a lot of people got to come to terms with, but it is what it is. Time is not going to wait. Uh, and you will see when because God always confirms uh, his his children, his word. God always backs up um, what He is doing in the earth. So yeah, I knew it was going to be hard for a lot of people to hear. It's for somebody to discover on a podcast that Adam and Eve were not actual historical characters. They're like that's it's not it's not an idea. It's like it's proven at this point. It's so much evidence overwhelming. So I know a lot of this stuff is not hard to hear, and I hate to be the one to like snatch the rug from under your foot. Uh, but it's time. there's a new you that awaits. There's an audience that awaits your talents and your gifts, and it's time for you to be updated and do the upgrade. All right, I'm done for tonight. I'll be back. I'll let you know when I'm back. Hopefully, I wasn't rambling too much, and you actually got something out of uh, tonight's show. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will definitely be looking out for your comments, your questions. Um, but yeah, thank you. Good night.